What started as a heated moment between the Indiana Fever and Chicago Sky quickly became something much bigger in the eyes of the public. The confrontation itself was only the beginning. Once the footage began circulating, the reaction moved almost instantly from the arena to social media, where viewers were no longer simply debating a basketball play. They were debating intent, consequences, and whether the situation had crossed a line that the league could no longer ignore. The transcript describes the incident as a hard hit on Sophie Cunningham during the matchup, followed by an immediate eruption of emotion around the court. That moment became the visual centerpiece of the controversy because it was simple to understand even without knowing every detail surrounding the rivalry. One piece of footage was enough to create a much larger argument. And then came the reaction. According to the source, video of the incident spread rapidly across social platforms, followed by intense criticism and calls for stronger consequences. The story was no longer confined to what happened during the game. Every reaction created another reaction, and every new comment added another layer to the controversy. What might have remained a disputed moment inside one game was now becoming a public test of how the league would respond. That is what makes the opening moment so important. The hit itself created the shock, but the aftermath created the real story. Once fans began demanding answers, the question changed from what happened on the court to what would happen next. And that question would become increasingly difficult to contain, because the next stage of the controversy was not just about the incident. It was about the response to it. But once the footage spread, the controversy stopped belonging to the arena. The reaction became its own story. The source describes video of the incident moving rapidly across social media, followed by a wave of criticism that intensified within minutes. What viewers had seen on the court was now being replayed, discussed, judged, and argued over by an audience far larger than the people who had been inside the building. That speed changed the pressure surrounding the situation. A controversial moment can disappear when the final whistle blows, but this one continued gaining attention after the game was over. According to the transcript, calls for boycotts began trending, ticket cancellations were being discussed, and corporate sponsors were reportedly threatening to reconsider their involvement. Whether every reaction carried the same weight was almost beside the point. The controversy had developed momentum of its own. And that created a new problem for the league. The more the public conversation grew, the harder it became to treat the incident as an isolated moment between players. The focus shifted toward accountability. Fans wanted to know what consequences would follow, while commentators continued examining the incident and the response surrounding it. The pressure was no longer coming from one direction. It was coming from multiple sides at once. Then came another critical development, the response from Carrington herself. The transcript describes a late-night online statement in which she pushed back against an interpretation of her comments and argued that she had not made the claim being attributed to her. That statement introduced a new layer of conflict because now the controversy was no longer only about the original incident. It was also about what had been said afterward, what people believed had been meant, and whether the response would actually reduce the pressure. Instead, the debate kept moving. The public had already seen the footage. Now they were watching the reaction to the reaction. And as that cycle continued, the question became harder to avoid. Could the league contain a controversy that was growing faster than the original incident itself? Then the controversy took another turn, because the response itself became part of the argument. After the incident and the growing public reaction, Dejanai Carrington addressed one of the claims being attributed to her. In the statement quoted in the source, she pushed back directly, saying, "I've never once claimed that the assessment of the foul was white privilege. That was your assumption." That distinction mattered because it changed what people were arguing about. The conversation was no longer limited to the foul itself. Now viewers were also examining the language surrounding it, the meaning people had assigned to those comments, and Carrington's attempt to clarify her position. She continued by challenging the interpretation and defending her understanding of the subject, saying she had studied it extensively and would not use the term as a rhetorical weapon without proper evidence. Those are Carrington's own publicly quoted words in the source, and they are important precisely because they show how she characterized her position after the controversy had already begun spreading. But clarification does not automatically end a controversy. The transcript immediately introduces commentary questioning the circumstances surrounding the statement. One commentator argued that the incident should be viewed as a basketball play and a refereeing decision, while emphasizing the severity of the contact. That created a competing interpretation of what the public should be focusing on. And this is where the story became more complicated. One side of the discussion was focused on what Carrington said she meant. Another was focused on what had happened on the court and how the incident should be evaluated. Meanwhile, the audience was left to decide whether the clarification actually addressed the concerns surrounding the original controversy. That uncertainty became a retention engine of its own. If the response was meant to settle the argument, why was the argument still growing? The answer would depend on what happened next, because the controversy was moving toward a point where a statement alone might no longer be enough. The pressure was beginning to shift away from the players and toward the people with the authority to respond. And then the controversy reached a different level. The conversation was no longer being driven only by players, fans, or social media reactions. Prominent public figures were now entering the discussion, and each new voice added a different kind of pressure. One of the first major shifts came when former NBA center Enes Kanter Freedom announced that he was entering the WNBA draft conversation. In the source, his message was framed as a warning about how the league was handling the controversy. He argued that if players were not being protected from what he described as targeted physical treatment and toxic behavior, he would be willing to step onto the court himself. Whether that statement would ever translate into action was a separate question. But as a piece of the story, it created an enormous pattern interrupt. Suddenly, the controversy had expanded beyond the people directly involved in the game. Then another voice entered from the political world. The transcript quotes Florida Attorney General James Uthmere discussing the incident and saying that, in Florida, conduct of that nature could have resulted in criminal charges. His comments introduced a completely different kind of authority into the conversation. This was no longer simply a disagreement between commentators about a foul. A government official was publicly discussing the conduct in legal terms. That distinction matters. The statement did not establish that criminal charges had been filed. It showed that the incident had become significant enough to attract commentary from outside the basketball world. And then came Stephen A. Smith. The transcript describes Smith delivering a forceful response on television, criticizing both the player involved and league leadership. His comments focused on the idea that the league could not separate the conduct from the consequences once public pressure had intensified. That moment changed the tone again. A former professional player had already raised the possibility of entering the league. A state attorney general had publicly weighed in. Now one of the most recognizable sports commentators was openly attacking the response to the controversy. The audience was no longer watching a single disputed incident. They were watching a story involving players, media personalities, political authority, and eventually league leadership. And that raised the next question: when a controversy reaches this many powerful voices, who ultimately decides where the line is? At this point, the controversy reached a level where the consequences mattered more than the arguments themselves. The transcript claims that WNBA executives and team managers were engaged in discussions about possible disciplinary measures, including the possibility of a lifetime suspension and significant financial penalties. But there is an important distinction here: the source presents these as reported discussions, not as confirmed decisions. That distinction changes the question. Up to this point, the public debate had largely centered on what people thought about the incident. Now the focus was shifting toward what the league could actually do about it. A fine would send one message. A suspension would send another. And the possibility of a much more severe punishment would signal that league leadership viewed the controversy as something requiring an extraordinary response. But none of those possibilities automatically meant they were going to happen. The transcript's framing is built around pressure. Public criticism had intensified, prominent voices were demanding accountability, and the league was being portrayed as facing a growing public relations problem. That creates a difficult position for any organization: respond too weakly, and critics may say leadership failed to act; respond too aggressively, and the punishment itself can become another controversy. That is where the story becomes genuinely uncertain. The league-level question is not simply whether someone should be punished. It is how far the consequences can go before the response creates an entirely different problem. The transcript also connects the controversy to the league's broader financial growth, arguing that executives would have to consider the economic consequences of continued conflict. Again, that is the source's framing rather than proof of a specific internal decision. What it does reveal is the scale at which the narrator wants the audience to view the situation. This is no longer being presented as an argument that ends when the next game begins. It is being presented as a decision facing league leadership, with competing pressures coming from players, fans, commentators, and the wider public. And that leaves the biggest unanswered question yet. If the league really is forced to choose between protecting its players, controlling the controversy, and preserving its broader interests, what happens when those priorities collide? But the controversy did not stop with the question of discipline. Instead, the discussion expanded into something much broader, and suddenly the original incident was being used as a doorway into a debate about eligibility, standards, and who should be allowed to compete. This is where the conversation changes completely. The transcript presents several possible approaches discussed by commentators. One option is to reject the outside challenge altogether and treat it as a public relations stunt. Another is to establish or apply a specific standard for transgender eligibility. A third approach discussed is defining eligibility according to biological sex. And the fourth possibility presented is accepting the challenge and dealing with whatever consequences might follow. These are positions expressed within the source's discussion. They are not presented here as established league policy or confirmed future decisions. What makes the debate powerful from a storytelling perspective is that every proposed solution creates another problem. Reject one approach, and the commentators argue that the controversy continues. Establish another standard, and questions immediately emerge about how that standard would be applied. Define eligibility differently, and the discussion becomes entangled with competing political and cultural reactions. Accept everyone without resolving the underlying concerns, and the commentators predict another set of consequences. So the original question, what should happen after the incident, has now transformed into something much larger. The discussion is no longer simply about one player, one foul, or one disciplinary decision. It is about the rules that determine eligibility and the consequences of changing or enforcing those rules. Then the conversation becomes even more speculative. The commentators begin asking what percentage of current WNBA players might fall into categories they are discussing. Those claims are presented as questions and personal speculation in the transcript, not as verified information. That distinction is critical, because the conversation has moved from something visible on video into assertions about people for which the source provides no evidence. And that is exactly where the controversy becomes harder to contain. Once a single incident opens the door to a much broader policy argument, resolving the original dispute no longer resolves the conversation. The audience is left with a completely different question. If the debate has already expanded this far, what happens when the players involved meet again and the next controversy arrives? And now the controversy reaches the point where the next meeting could matter more than the last one. The transcript notes that Indiana and Chicago are scheduled to meet again, but by this stage, the meaning surrounding that matchup has changed. What was once another game on the schedule is now being presented as a potential test of whether the tension surrounding these teams can actually be contained. The biggest unanswered question is what happens if the controversy follows the players back onto the court. The source raises the possibility of Carrington being forced off the court permanently, while also asking whether the league could intervene before another confrontation turns into something even more serious. Those are questions raised by the source, not confirmed outcomes. There's no established result here to point to. That uncertainty is precisely what keeps the story open. Then there is the outside pressure. Former NBA figures, media personalities, political voices, fans, and league leadership have all been pulled into the conversation at different points. But their involvement does not produce one unified answer. Instead, it creates competing expectations about what the league should do next. Should discipline become more severe? Should the league focus on preventing another incident? Should outside voices have any influence over how the controversy is handled? Or does the attention itself risk making the next matchup even more intense? Those questions cannot be answered by replaying the original incident alone. The footage explains why the controversy started. The reactions explain why it grew. But what happens next will determine whether this remains a major argument surrounding one incident or becomes the beginning of an even larger conflict. And that is where the story currently stands, not with a final verdict, but with another meeting ahead, more scrutiny surrounding the league, and an audience waiting to see whether the next chapter settles the tension or creates an even bigger one.